Hi, it's Jonathan. In this week's episode of Good Authority, I wanted to try and start a conversation with you about masculinity, about manhood, and about boyhood, and share some ideas for us to talk about together. You heard in a recent episode Gary Barker speak really eloquently about some of the challenges boys face in the modern world, especially here in the West, but really globally. Some of the real and intractable challenges that boys are facing to discover their identity and figure out what does it actually mean to be a man in the world, to be a man in my world. And this conversation is even difficult to have because, like every other topic in the modern discourse, it's this binary, right? There's this macho, tough veneer that so many people talk about and sell, especially on the internet and social media, that is happening on one side. And there's another conversation around vulnerability and men learning how to open up and talk about their emotions. And these worlds really live split, which of course is the problem because there's truth on both sides. And I wanted to share with you a little bit about my own journey in this terrain because I wrestled a lot with a lot of the confusion that I think a lot of boys and a lot of men still face. Here I am at 51 and I meet a lot of guys my age who are really struggling with this topic. What does it mean to be a man in the modern world? What's the right amount of toughness? What's the right amount of sexuality that I'm allowed to have? Where do I go with that? How do I show up in a way that actually honors who I am and the feelings that I have and the strength that I want to embody in the world, but do that in a way that actually brings me together, that creates intimacy with my partner, whatever the sexuality of the relationship is? How do I show up in the world in a way that's meaningful to me, that doesn't sell myself out, but is also not putting myself on an island? And one of the things that Gary and I talked about is if we don't offer models, role models, perspectives for boys to consider an integrated view of manhood, well, you can see what they're going to find on the internet. They're going to find Andrew Tate, or maybe more palatable versions of Andrew Tate. They're going to find men mostly who will sell them on a version of masculinity that is incredibly limited, but also has a deep truth in it. Because there is something to that primal sexuality in men. There is something to how we show up in the world that we cannot lose and shouldn't lose just because we also have learned and we've evolved to accept that we also need to be in touch with our emotions. We also need to be vulnerable. We also want to be part of a group. We want to lift up other people, that it's not just about going for mine, right? Which is the dialogue on one side. But like most conversations these days, we're stuck in this binary. Which one is it, right? Is it, being a tough guy, or is it being soft and vulnerable? And it's a bullshit narrative. Masculinity, true masculinity, evolved masculinity is about being both. Sometimes I talk about this idea of having a hard body and a soft heart. I want both of those things. I want the guys in my life, the men in my life, whatever generation, however old they are, any boys that I get to influence, I want them to think about it that way. I want you to be tough. I want you to be strong, whatever strong. It doesn't mean you have to have a six-pack and look like some lean Instagram model. There's like 3 guys who can do that, and it's mostly genetic, okay? That's not an ideal that any of us should be striving for. So whatever your body's potential is, great. Let's maximize that. Let's do all of the things: fasting, eating right, exercising, working on VO2 max, building strength, building balance, working on your core, right? All of these things, thinking about your nutrition, thinking about what you put in your body, thinking about how much alcohol you consume, if you consume it at all, thinking about how much of your time you spend on the internet, how much of your time you spend playing video games or watching sports or being a spectator to the world instead of living it and getting out and having adventures and doing things. Those are really important conversations, and we could spend an hour talking about any one of those things. But as we talked about in this conversation with Gary, that's a real big part, but it's not the whole thing. And I know for myself, when I was a kid, I spent most of my time playing sports in one form or another. The moment that bell rang, my friends and I, we were out playing whatever: baseball, stickball, basketball, run around being crazy, riding our bikes, whatever we could do to be physical, to be out in the world, to be doing things. And we had video games back then, except video games back then was like Atari and Coleco. Congratulations if you still have one of those consoles. It's a real different world these days. I got nothing against video games. There's actually some really interesting data that when boys are spending time on the internet playing video games, at least they tend to be talking to each other while they're doing it, versus a lot of the challenges for girls when they're on the internet. They tend to more be on social media. It's a lot more comparison about looks and visual appearance. So there's a little bit of a silver lining with boys playing video games. It's not my favorite thing. It's not something I spend a lot of time doing these days. And I'd rather be outside, and I'd rather boys be outside, moving their bodies and building strength that way. But this is not a screed against video games. They're fine. Like all things within measure, they're fine. But that part of being a man was familiar to me. I knew about sports. I knew that was accepted. I knew about being tough, even though my group of friends wasn't the real tough kids. We were kind of in the middle. We were sort of the hybrid, like, student athlete types. We weren't great athletes. We weren't great students. We were kind of somewhere in the middle. And so that was a world that I was comfortable in. I was comfortable in those worlds, but I wasn't comfortable talking about myself. I certainly wasn't comfortable psychologically. I wasn't comfortable in anything resembling intimacy. Not that teenage romance has a lot of intimacy to it, but I was terrified. I had no idea. I had no resources. I didn't have anybody that I felt I could talk to about all the confusing feelings that I had towards the opposite sex. And it was an incredibly confusing and anxiety-producing time, like it is for a lot of kids, right? I know that I'm not alone in that. But where was I going to turn for a conversation about that? I didn't have a place like that. And the work that Gary and so many other people are doing is to make sure that boys have a place where they can have those conversations, where they learn a version of masculinity, a version of growing up that is balanced between the external and the internal, balanced between the ambitious and the reflective. And that journey doesn't have a lot of great heroes for that type of balanced masculinity. Obviously, we have incredible athletes and people who are doing incredible things physically in pro sports and otherwise. We have incredible intellectuals, people who can spout about topics with huge complexity and use that part of their mind and really explain and explicate topics in a really powerful way. We have some role models for that out in the world. We have some role models for what does it mean to be vulnerable, transparent, but most of those role models are women. When it comes to having emotions as a man, being emotional, understanding what the difference is between an emotion and just a passing feeling of being angry or frustrated or bitter about something, or just happy or joyful. That's not really what we're talking about with emotion. We're talking about the deep stuff, our identity, who we are, how we think about ourselves, how we relate with our world. So this is a completely foreign language for most men in most places in the world these days. Indigenous cultures do a far better job of teaching boys through rites of passage, through ways of understanding oneself and one's relation to the world and the community than we do here in our more suburban, urban, insulated kind of transactional society, where we don't have a lot of rites and rituals unless you're part of a religious group. And those religious groups all have challenges, like many of you have spoken to as well. The one upside of religious and spiritual groups that you may be part of is they provide structure. They do provide some ritual. I started to find that in the world of psychedelics through ceremony, right? If you can get past the obvious and sort of like basic, triggers that people tend to have, whether it's about religion or about spirituality or about sacred medicine, a lot of the reason why people value those things is because there's ritual. There's something about ritual and predictability and ceremony and people coming together in an intentional way that's incredibly powerful that we don't really value at all in our culture. The closest thing we have is when we go to a sporting event and everyone feels like family, right? For a moment in time, at least when their team is either winning or losing, we kind of bond and we feel together, we're united in that. But there's not a lot of ritual that feels good to us in the rest of our life. Most of us kind of wake up in the morning, we get into our day, whatever feels good to us, and then we go to work we work with our team. It tends to be very transactional these days, especially if we work remotely. We go home to our nuclear family if we have one. A lot of people don't have that. And we sort of go through these series of transactions without a real framework, without any sense of ceremony or ritual, and the time just kind of bleeds out on us. And for boys to become men, it's really important that we don't let that happen. We need those rites of passage. We need moments where we can talk amongst ourselves as boys, where we can talk with older boys and men and elders to understand ourselves in the context of our world. Because as we talked about earlier, if we don't have those opportunities, if we don't have those role models, if we don't have people who are willing to lean into those conversations, well, we're going to find role models, but they're not going to be the role models that you want us to find. So, as I said, this is really a start of a conversation around masculinity and a call really to see this conversation evolve. When I first got started in what I would loosely call men's work, so this was in the 2000s, and I was really in a place of starting to understand myself. There were some good thinkers out there, but it was really kind of the classic sort of Iron John, David Data, kind of like tough, be tough and like show up in this way that it's going to be attractive to women. And a lot of it sort of defaulted into like being a guy that women wanted to be with and learning how to pick up women. And there was a kind of this whole thing that went with a lot of those forms of manhood. And then there were these really powerful circles where we got together and we yelled at each other and we criticized each other and we got naked, not physically naked, although sometimes, but really just we got emotionally naked and stripped down, and men were telling each other, what they thought. And there's something good about that, right? There's something good about that. There's something meaningful about it. But catharsis only goes so far. And most people don't really give good advice. Most people give advice through the lens of their own conditioning. So it's rare to encounter a group of men where you really feel seen and you feel like you have a group of men who can meet you in the right domains of your life, whether it's around work or intimacy, sexuality, anxiety, depression, fear. So it's rare. There's very few men who have a group of friends who they can talk with subjects like that. I feel very blessed to have a few, not a lot, but I've got a few men in my life that I can have those conversations with. I'd love to have more, but it's challenging. The research shows men tend to have fewer and fewer friends as they get older. So to call for you in your life, or if you want to support a man in your life that you care about, to really find ways to create some new pathways, to find other men to talk to about whatever, right? There's some pretty good sociological research that men tend to operate and open up when they're doing something together. That may sound a little bit stereotypical, but the concept of sitting in a circle and talking about deep and meaningful things, I've experienced in kind of traveling in these circles for the last 25 years. Women tend to be more comfortable in those environments. Men tend to be more comfortable and open up when they're like next to each other rather than, facing directly eye to eye, although that can work too. But what does that look like in your life? Who are the men that you can talk with? And how do you even start that conversation just to say, hey, I actually want to have more and deeper friendships, relationships with men in my life, and I don't know how to do it. Can we fumble around together and figure that out? Again, if you're lucky enough to have a good friend, you maybe have a model for that, but it's great to have more people like that. It's great to have people from other generations, men who are older than you, men who are younger than you, who offer different perspectives. I have the opportunity to work with a group of men, mostly who are much younger than me. There's a couple who are around my age, and I really try to listen to the language that they use and the way they think about the world, and just appreciate that being 51, I'm really in a different generation. I grew up in a very different time than people who grew up, who are now, in their early 30s or their late 20s. So I try to listen. I don't always get it right, but I try to remember that my generation had a certain set of conditioning that's different. And yet there's a way that we can talk with each other, that we can build bridges and have connections. So my goal for this episode today was really to just put a line in the sand that a lot of what's missing from the world of authority and leadership in our world is men. and men who know how to balance being strong, being assertive, embodying the yang aspect of masculinity, while also knowing about and being practiced in the yin aspect of masculinity. It's one of the weird things. People think yang means male and yin means female. It's not. We both have both. What's the yang version in a man? What's the yang version in a woman? What's the yin version in man? What's the yin version in a woman? So I just want to close this episode by standing for what I believe, which is that this crisis of manhood, this crisis of boyhood, is one of the most pressing challenges of our time. And we tend to get really interested in this topic at the most unfortunate moments, in particular when there's a school shooting, which is almost always, it's probably 99.9% of the time, from a young male and a young white male. So there's a crisis in our communities, and you hear the same things every time. The warning signs were there. It's not, oh, I had no idea he was ever capable of that. Actually, what you hear more and more, people are more honest, like, oh, yeah, he was on the outside. There was something off about him. There was something weird. He would say weird things, right? But we let it go. We let it pass. And we accept that there's nothing that we can do. We can do something. We can go talk to that boy who's struggling, or we don't even know why he's struggling. We don't even know what to say, but we can invite him to go do something, to try to pull him out of whatever lonely, isolated, and disconnected place that he may feel right now. And that could be the difference. So while programs like the ones Gary and other organizations are putting together are essential and beautiful and profound as we try to tackle this very real crisis, each one of us, no matter your gender, no matter your age, no matter what you do for a living, you interact with boys every single day. You can just smile at them. You can tell them a joke. You can invite them to go do something. You can ask them a question and see if you can invite them into a dialogue. And those conversations are the conversations that change one boy's world and change our world. Thanks so much for listening. Thanks so much for listening to Good Authority. If you enjoyed the conversation, please be sure to get subscribed and leave us a review over at Apple or Spotify or both. You can share the episode with friends, family, colleagues, and maybe even your arch enemy. And you'll be getting new episodes every Wednesday. Thanks so much for listening.